I'm really delighted today to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker, the Rappaport Center's third and final senior fellow in residence for this academic year, Professor Lance Freeman. Professor Freeman teaches in the Urban Planning Program at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. This year, as you may know, the Rappaport Center has been focusing on issues related to equity and inequality, and Dr. Freeman's scholarship is directly on point. He focuses on affordable housing, gentrification, ethnic and racial stratification in housing markets, and the relationship between the built environment and well-being. Professor Freeman is the author of 2 books and multiple articles. His latest book, A Haven and a Hell, published this year by Columbia University Press, addresses how Black urban neighborhoods are products of institutional racism and economic neglect, while also being places of refuge and community. Excuse me. He explores how the ghetto shaped Black America and how Black America shaped the ghetto, a subject reflected in his previous book as well, There Goes the Hood, Views of Gentrification from the Ground Up. Apropos of the Rappaport Center's mission, Dr. Freeman has also worked in the public sector. He served as a city planner for the New York City Housing Authority and as a budget analyst for the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. He holds a master's degree and PhD in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Please welcome Professor Lance.
Well, thank you, and really delighted to have the opportunity to come here and talk to you all. It's always exciting anytime I have an opportunity to talk to a room full of people who are willing to listen to hear what I have to say. If I could just get my kids to do the same, I'd really be excited. But this is probably second best, is not quite as good as having my kids listen to me, but a reasonable replacement. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about research that I've done, some of it drawn from my latest book, and just to give you a little bit of background, how I got interested or how I was drawn to this topic. I'm a native New Yorker, came of age in New York during the 1980s. The city was just emerging from the financial crisis. It was a time when many neighborhoods were experiencing significant distress and disinvestment. And that got me really interested in what were some of the factors causing that distress. And in particular, it was mostly, overwhelmingly in non-white neighborhoods where you saw the most severe disinvestment, the most severe distress. And that's what led me to pursue a career in urban planning. I thought it was a field that would allow me to learn about the factors that were causing urban problems in places like New York, cities like Boston too, though. And I, ultimately went to graduate school to study urban planning. Made a few detours, worked in Washington, D.C. and Delaware. But by the time I got back to New York around the turn of the century, what was happening was that many of the same neighborhoods that had been experiencing significant distress and disinvestment were starting to change, and you were starting to see neighborhoods experience what we call gentrification. And with that, despite the fact that many of these neighborhoods had experienced widespread abandonment and the like, there was a significant amount of fear and criticism of gentrification. And to me, it created what I see as a dilemma, right? So this slide, it depicts a quote by an urban sociologist who says, on the one hand, liberal urban specialists rail against the suburbanization of America and the abandonment of the cities by the nation's whites, right? So that was part of the trends that led to the disinvestment and deterioration that got me interested in urban planning in the first place. But on the other hand, when a very few and highly selected whites buck the trend and stake a claim in the city, they are berated as opportunists and decried for gentrifying the inner city. And on the right side of this slide, there was an article bemoaning the loss or the end of Black Harlem, right? And so to me, that seemed to be something of a dilemma. On the one hand, you had high desegregation, disinvestment that had led to the ghettoization of African Americans and other minorities and the subsequent decline of those communities. Yet at the same time, gentrification was viewed very suspiciously, right? So this is what really got me interested in this topic. And looking back in time, you see this playing out in previous times during the time right after the passage of the fair housing laws in the late 1960s, when the federal government attempted to implement a policy of open housing. There were many in the Black community that were suspicious of that. And also, again, more recently, when under the Obama administration, when they attempted to implement the affirmatively furthering fair housing policy, which was supposed to be a policy that would go beyond simply outlawing discrimination, but also possibly promoting integration. And again, here, this quote says, our underprivileged families should have the right to choose where they want to live, and that choice should include the right to stay in the neighborhoods where they have grown up. This is the Houston mayor, Sylvester Turner, in 2017 making this argument. And then more recently, another illustration of this in Washington, D.C. A few years ago, they adopted a policy known as the Creative Capital City, adopted from the writings of Richard Florida, who wrote the book, The Creative Class. The idea was that to strengthen the city's economy, attempts should be made to attract young, upwardly mobile professionals to the city as an economic development strategy. Yet, many were suspicious of this policy as reflected by this lawsuit that has been undertaken to challenge the practice of attempting to attract young urban professionals to Washington, D.C. So these are some of the examples I think illustrate this dilemma. And my first book was based on thinking about how people in gentrifying neighborhoods felt about the process of gentrification, and in a sense, what they felt about their neighborhoods. But I also became interested in how people felt about these neighborhoods in the past. How did African Americans experience or view these neighborhoods in the past, right? And so that serves as the basis of my second book, and I'm going to share with you some of the findings from that and use that to help us to think about how people view gentrification and other types of neighborhood change, and how we might think about public policy in these communities today, given this history. So first, the ghetto as a haven. I use the term haven to signify that in some instances, people value these communities. They see all these places as places of refuge. And I think the historical context is very important to understand this. So if you go back in time to the late 19th century, most blacks were still living in the South, about 90%. They were disenfranchised. Blacks in the North could vote. But again, the overwhelming majority of blacks at this time are living in the South without the power, without access to the ballot, okay? This is the time of what you could say is uncontested white supremacy, right? Blacks in the South were living in near serf-like status. And even internationally, if you look at Africa, this is a time when whites had colonized nearly the entire continent, okay? So this is sort of the nadir of race relations from the perspective of African Americans. We're talking about the turn of the last century. So at this time, what happens, you start to see a younger generation of blacks coming of age. These are blacks who are coming of age with no direct history of slavery, right? And so they're coming out of age in the first decades of the 20th century. Some of them go off to fight in World War I, and you see the adoption of a new attitude, if you will. The term used at that time was the new Negro. And Jesse Binga is an example of that. I use him as an example because he was instrumental in creating the Black Belt of Chicago. What he would do is he would purchase properties that excluded blacks. He would then displace the white residents and then turn around and rent these same units to blacks. So he was an early day flipper, if you will. But just as importantly, as symbolically as what he represented someone who achieved economic success. He was someone who was a living illustration that blacks could compete in the modern economy. And just as importantly, he was not relying on whites to establish his wealth or to build a black community, right? So he's, in some sense, turning away from the old school or the old view, which is that blacks had to rely on whites in order to move ahead, okay? And you see this also playing out in terms of culture as well, right? And again, this is the first decades of the 20th century. You have the Harlem Renaissance movement, which was an artistic movement with the political motivations to show that African Americans could indeed produce sophisticated art and thus were worthy of civil rights. And that was a movement led primarily by the black elite, you could say, but also among the masses, right? This is a time when you had the United Negro Improvement Association led by Marcus Garvey. And the commonality here, again, is that blacks were coming together in these communities and they were taking pride in being black. They were not denying their African heritage, right? And so many people, again, call this new orientation evidence of a new Negro. And then finally, you also see this playing out in terms of politics, okay? So remember I said that prior to this time, the vast majority of blacks were disenfranchised. By moving to the north, and although they were segregated, one of the things that this segregation did is that it gave blacks a political voice, because a congressman that was elected, and here is the example of Oscar DePriest, who was the first black congressman in the 20th century. What it did is he represented obviously the individuals in his congressional district, but he also represented the entire race. He was viewed as someone who was a congressperson, not just for the south side of Chicago. And if you look at black newspapers written at this time, for example, they'll refer to our congressman, even if it's a Boston newspaper, they would talk about someone in Chicago and Harlem as our congressman, because it was understood and the expectation was that this congressperson would represent the interests not only of his geographic district, but of the entire race throughout the country, because blacks were largely disenfranchised in the South. Okay, so this is the early years, and I think you start to see implications of this when we think about the federal government's involvement in housing policy in the 1930s. So blacks had started to establish these communities. They still were intensely opposed to housing discrimination, but you start to see, when you look at actual policies that contribute to segregation, you start to see something of a contradiction. And I'll share with you an example, right? So during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the federal government becomes involved in the housing market in a big way for the first time. They get involved in insuring mortgages to help resuscitate the housing market, and they get involved in building public housing as a way of both providing construction jobs and also clearing the slums. So the practice of redlining, which was something that when African American institutions became aware of, it was something that they protested against, as indicated by the headline in this black newspaper on the left panel of this slide. And this is what you probably would expect. Public housing, though, right? And for those of you not familiar with the way public housing was implemented, when it was initially started in the 1930s, the federal government would build developments for whites in white neighborhoods and developments for blacks in black neighborhoods. So obviously reinforcing patterns of segregation. However, the way the policy was viewed was one that was giving resources to African Americans. It was also at this time that the federal government said that we're going to try to hire blacks to build and staff these public housing developments, right? So you see this duality here in terms of how blacks reacted to the practice of redlining versus public housing, even though both contributed to the segregation and both were discriminatory at their foundation. If we look at the middle of the 20th century, you start to see a little bit of a change, right? So for the first time, right, so now we're talking about the post-World War II era. You start to have African Americans who were born in the North, right, or who had lived in the North for a while. And for them, and I don't know how clearly you can make this out, this is an image taken from the magazine Our World, which is a picture magazine modeled on the magazine Life, similar to Ebony. And what this article is showing is that blacks are buying homes in suburban-like settings, right? And the story, if you read it, what it's showing is that whereas in the first decades of the 20th century, the very fact that blacks were moving from the South to cities was seen as a great milestone, a great advancement. By the middle of the 20th century, that's less the case, right? Because you have blacks that have been living in the North for a while. What's seen as a symbol of advancement is achieving the same milestones that whites are at that time, which is moving to the suburbs, buying a home, and the like. Yet at the same time, you still are having the mass of blacks leaving the South, as indicated by this chart. Probably can't make out the numbers, but what it's showing is that the Great Migration takes off again after World War II, with blacks leaving the South in droves and moving to cities like Boston, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and the like. And slowly what you start to see though over time is that the black population in these predominantly black neighborhoods starts to peak around 1950 and starts to decline thereafter, right? So for blacks as a whole, you could say 1950 is the high watermark where blacks are, it's the peak of the Great Migration. You still have many blacks who see these northern neighborhoods as the promised land. It starts to decline thereafter. But, and you can see this friction, this duality playing out again if you think about the policy of urban renewal, okay? So this is another interesting case, I think, because urban renewal was ostensibly a policy that would clear the slums and replace slum housing with modern housing. And so for many blacks, it presented something of a dilemma. On the one hand, you had some blacks who subscribed to a more integrationist school of thought, like Robert Weaver, who would become the first HUD secretary. He saw urban renewal as an opportunity to dismantle segregated slum housing and move people into integrated housing on the outskirts of major cities. Other blacks were somewhat skeptical, though, as this headline suggests. Other blacks were skeptical of the notion that the federal government would come in and condemn their properties and turn it into something else and that they would have to move it elsewhere, right? So the headline says it's a big steal, right? And remember, again, when I went back and looked at some of these archives, the way people viewed these neighborhoods, remember I talked about how Jesse Benga, how he acquired properties. Many people viewed these neighborhoods as neighborhoods they had to fight to move into and that they would have to fight to hold on to, right? So they didn't necessarily, although the neighborhoods might have been designated as slums, many people didn't view it that way. They viewed these neighborhoods as their communities, communities that they fought to move into, and that they were willing to fight to hold on to. In the end, neither side really won out. We certainly didn't see urban renewal used to promote integration, but I'm using it here just to illustrate a point about how within the Black community there were conflicting views on the program of urban renewal, and how it highlights how some people viewed these communities as places of refuge, as places that they wanted to hold on to, not places that they wanted to be moved out of. And then the final, the next to last example I'll share with you is the era of the 1960s, the era of Black power, right? And this is a time when you have a resurgence in Black nationalism, the notion that you should have Black autonomy, Black empowerment, and also you start to hear people talking about a call for physical space or land, right? Here's a quote from Malcolm X. He says, revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. And this is not necessarily a new idea. If you look back in time, at various points in time, people have talked about African Americans moving back to Africa, which of course happened to a limited extent with the establishment of Liberia in the 19th century. There were calls to colonize a West Indian island or two after the Civil War. Of course, you had the exodusters in the late 19th century when some Blacks left the South to establish settlements in Kansas and Oklahoma. Others have called for the development of a Black nation in some parts of the South. None of these ideas, perhaps not surprisingly, caught on, right? It's unrealistic in many regards that any of them could ever actually have come to fruition, right? But the reason I bring this point into my presentation is that the thinking or the ideology, I think, did influence what happened in many neighborhoods, right? So instead of Blacks moving back to Africa or something fantastic like that, what you have is what some call a community nationalism, right? And so you start to see Blacks exerting more control over institutions within their own communities in the 1960s. And you see it particularly in the area of Black politics, right? This is the first time you're starting to see Black politicians elected to citywide or mayoral office. You see the development of community-based organizations like community development corporations. They come into the fore at this time in many cities, such as New York City, for example. Neighborhood school districts come into being at this time. And so the nationalism that I just was described in the previous slide, which talks about Blacks creating their own nation, that did not happen. But you did start to see a nationalism that influenced institutions at the neighborhood and at the municipal level. And I think the legacy of that, we still see that to this day, right? And you also saw the influence of nationalism within the Black arts movement, right? This is another artistic movement that had political motivations, much like the Harlem Renaissance, right? The difference here is that the movement was one designed to promote, again, a sense of racial pride among African Americans, and a way of organizing, right, and galvanizing the community. And again, it was within Black neighborhoods that you saw this movement reach its zenith, okay? So the 1960s was a time when Black nationalism was at the forefront of Black thought in many ways. And you see it manifested both politically and institutionally in terms of the types of institutions that came about during this time. And you also see it culturally as well, as evidenced by the rise of the Black arts movement, okay? So if we think about that history and we fast forward to today, right? So I started my talk talking about the threat of gentrification and explaining how people view these neighborhoods, how people are reacting to the changes brought about by gentrification. I think it starts to become a little bit clearer, at least to my point of view, right? And so what's happening more recently, many black neighborhoods, which during most of the 20th century experienced significant white flight. This chart shows the number or the proportion of black neighborhoods experiencing an increase in their white population. And what you see is that, I don't know if you can make this out, this is the 1980s, this is the 1990s, this is the 2000, and this is 2010, 2016. You see a big increase, right, in this century, a big increase in the proportion of black neighborhoods that are experiencing an influx of whites. Interestingly, I looked at this, this is a sort of a digression of what's happening in Boston. And Boston is a city that, interestingly, has somewhat bucked this trend. I'm not sure why, but if you look at the map on the panel on the right, this just shows heavily non-white neighborhoods. Out of curiosity, I juxtaposed it next to a map showing areas that were redlined in the 1930s. And probably is no surprise, there's some coincidence between the neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s and neighborhoods that were predominantly black in 1980. But what happens in Boston, you slowly start to see that the non-white population starts to spread out across the metropolitan area. And you don't really see the big influx of whites into these predominantly non-white areas. Other cities I have looked at, such as New York, Washington, DC, Chicago, you do see that. Not sure why Boston is sort of bucking that trend. And maybe some of you in the audience might have some ideas about that. But across the country, you are starting to see that. New York City, where I'm located, neighborhoods like Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Washington, D.C., another city, New Orleans, particularly in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. I was recently in Grand Rapids, Michigan, giving a talk about this, right? So it is a trend that is happening. And what is oftentimes accompanying that is this fear of being pushed out, right? So this is an example from Boston where a community center is being, there's talk of repurposing it for new condominiums. And this is something that people associate with gentrification, right? So that the term, the very word gentrification has this connotation that the community will be taken away from them. Here, I'll share with you another example. This is from Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., there was a telecommunications store that would play go-go music in the afternoon, every day. This probably started in the 1990s. This is the area, those of you familiar with Washington, D.C., it's near the U Street corridor. As the neighborhood changed and the demographics of the population changed, some of the residents started to complain about the music that was being played. So what does that illustrate and what is that indicative of? Well, it garnered a lot of attention, right? It seems like a relatively simple conflict or neighborly conflict, but it sort of symbolized, to at least to many people in the community, this feeling that gentrification means their community or their neighborhood is being taken away from them, right? And so I have just talked about how over decades, many of these neighborhoods had served as spaces of refuge. These were spaces where blacks were able to carve out some autonomy for themselves. And so gentrification, and this is a manifestation of that, by having newcomers come into the neighborhood and exert a certain political will. In this case, it's particularly simple. It's just the playing of music, but it could be symbolic of other changes as well. And so this actually garnered a lot of attention and is consistent with this notion that people feel like they're being pushed out. And there have been other examples in other cities that I could talk about as well. So you also see this notion of the ghetto as a mythical homeland. If you talk to people about why they may have moved to certain neighborhoods, they talk about feeling like it's a place where they belong, it's a place where they could find their identity, or it's a place that they want to move to because they want to restore it to its sort of so-called glory days in the latter example, right? And so this is all consistent with the notion that at least some people are viewing these spaces as important places that they cherish, okay? So, what's the takeaway? I think, despite the injustice and inequality inherent in ghettoization, right, these are still places that have been viewed as a haven or have served as a haven for African Americans, and many blacks still value these spaces, right? And I think this helps us understand the dilemma posed by gentrification, because on the policy side, many policymakers, I think, see gentrification as a solution to the urban ills that I described earlier in my presentation when I talked about how I got interested in urban planning. And I have to admit, to some extent, I shared that thought as well when I first came back to New York City and saw neighborhoods gentrifying. I said that, well, that seems like a positive thing, right? These are neighborhoods that have been depopulated, that have experienced disinvestment, and now they're being reintegrated into the larger city economy, right? But that, is probably comes as no surprise to you all. That's not the way many people view that, right? They view it differently, okay? And so what are some of the implications for that? I'll just share a couple of things, right? Because I don't want to take up the entire lunch hour. But to me, one of the things that I come away from this in terms of thinking about these neighborhoods is the importance of community mobilization and community empowerment, right? And so when I talk to people about gentrification, what comes out is that it's something that's being imposed on the community. It's something external to the community that's being placed upon it, right? And so I talk about community mobilization because I see it as a sort of a bulwark against that feeling, right? It's a way of giving residents a voice in the neighborhood. And just as an example, in Washington, D.C., the residents actually did come together, right? And they were able to persuade the owner of the property that the store owner should not have to stop playing the music because the majority of the people in the community did not find it troubling, right? So it's just a simple example of that. But again, I think the point I would emphasize is that when you're talking about people feeling like they're being pushed out, what that tells me is that they don't feel like they have a say in their community. So just to conclude, I think although segregation and the ghetto arose due to discrimination and racism, and this is still persistent to this day, we have to keep in mind that these same spaces served as a haven, and many people still cherish these communities. And I think, going forward, what we have to think about is continuing to provide opportunities for people that want to leave, whether it's through inclusionary zoning, or fair housing, other policies I'm happy to talk about. But also giving residents remaining behind the opportunity to stay, right? And a voice in their community, whether it's through something like community land trusts, a community advocacy, or community mobilization activities, or the like. And so I think when viewed from that lens, right, if we think about how these neighborhoods came about and the role that they have played in African American life, we can anticipate, right, how gentrification will be viewed, and we can also anticipate steps that can be taken so that we can encourage revitalization, yet at the same time, give people a chance or a voice to feel like they have a say in what's happening in their community. And so I'd like to stop here, and I guess we have some time for questions and answers. I was advised to call on the students first, so, so I'm not sure it was a student. I have to guess based on, you look like you could be a student, Dan, but I don't know. I know you're not, so I'm gonna call. I'll call on the gentleman to your left.
So I don't know too much about the housing over here in Boston, but before I came here, I was living in what's now called south of Central LA, which used to be called South Central LA. And what's happening is that the food for lesses are being replaced by Whole Foods, and basically the amenities that allowed people to live there in a cost affordable way are being pushed out for the University of Southern California right over there and the luxury needs of their students. So when you have the conflicting interests of the city pushing for this development, the university wanting to make things, I don't know, glamorous, for lack of a better word, what should the people that are still living in these houses that are kind of being pushed out economically, should they flip the property as it's kind of going on, hold it out and rent it out, or what else can they do when there's so many economic motivations pushing them out?
You're talking about the people that live in the community that own properties there or rent or?
Generally from a lot of the neighbors I talked to, they've been there for a few generations, they own the properties at this point, but the cost of living in those neighborhoods, outside of the cost of the value of the house, are going up, so it's not sustainable, from what I was hearing, for them to continue living there because of, cheap groceries, just to give an example, kind of moving away.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think there's a couple of things that they could think about doing, and I am familiar with the place you're talking about because I was in Los Angeles earlier this year, but I don't know it really intimately. But I am aware that USC is expanding in that area. So there's a couple of things, So one could be, to the extent that the university is not able to build as of right. Well, so let's say, for example, they need some type of rezoning, or they need some type of zoning variance, or if they're getting some type of, universities typically don't pay taxes, but some type of subsidy in some form, that's a pressure point that the people in the community can use as leverage to ask for something in return in exchange for supporting or not opposing a particular project. Where I work, Columbia University, for example, they're building a new campus in West Harlem, and one of the things that they did is they entered into a community benefits agreement with people in the community and promised to provide some benefits in exchange for the community not opposing the new campus. Now, that certainly has not been a panacea, and we could probably talk for a few days about how that was actually implemented or not, but that's the spirit, though, or the idea is something that could potentially work, right? Because if the university cannot build as of right, that means there's an approval process, and it's during those approval processes that things can be slowed down, and that can cost the developer, or in this case, the university, more money. And so that's a pressure point where you can use to extract some benefits, or there can be some exchange where the university provides some benefits in exchange for not, just running roughshod over the community. So Dan, I guess I'll ask you now.
Well, so first of all, let me just say what a pleasure it is to have you here and to welcome you. This is a wonderful presentation. I had a sort of personal question. I actually grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and then Crown Heights, and then Flatbush. And this was during the time when the white people were all leaving. So I was among the last white people in Bedford-Stuyvesant, then Crown Heights, same sort of thing. What I remember of the time is there was this powerful narrative and historical forces of the type you're describing, but there was also a complexifying factor, which was immigrant communities moving in. And by that I would actually also include a lot of people coming from Puerto Rico who are not, strictly speaking, immigrants. And I wonder how you factor that into the changing characteristics of these neighborhoods. Because as I remember that time, there was a lot of struggle there too, but it was a different kind of struggle.
Yeah, so that's true. I mean, some of the reaction to gentrification could be characterized or is in many ways similar to reactions you see about any type of neighborhood change, whether it's blacks moving into white neighborhoods or immigrants coming into a community. So that's certainly part of it, right? People don't necessarily, change can be uncomfortable for people, right? So I think when we think about gentrification, you do have to sort of bracket that is part of it. So I would say, and in the case of New York City, particularly, I talked about Harlem, for example. There's been a bigger influx of Latinos into Harlem than whites, for example. But I think because the class differences are not as stark, it's perhaps, I don't know if I want to say it's not as noticeable, or it doesn't seem to arouse as much suspicion or attention for whatever reason. So I think you do have to sort of bracket that fact that, some resistance to gentrification is similar to resistance to change of all types, right? So that certainly is part of it. I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but.
We have a whole way forward.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
So I have it's a fairly broad question, but your example with the go-go music made me think of like the barbecue Becky's that we see a lot, where like white folks intentionally enter black spaces or spaces where people of color predominate, and then use their power as a white person to dominate them in their own spaces, to either call the police or disrupt their merrymaking. Is there anything from your field of urban planning that can be done from a law and policy perspective in order to curb these kinds of interactions? Because they've been, a lot more publicized, and they seem to be escalating in a lot of areas. Where I went to college in Chicago, and Pilsen, which has always been a predominantly Latino neighborhood, is now becoming gentrified. And they had a serious problem where Mexican immigrants who have lived there for decades are being arrested for celebrations on their Independence Day because the neighbors don't like the noise. So I'm just curious if there's anything that can be done from a policy perspective about these folks in order to curb those kinds of difficulties.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wonder, though, if the law or public policy is the best way to address that. I'm not sure. The reason I say that is because there are all kinds of laws on the books. So these laws have been on the books for a while, and it's just to some extent a matter of whether or not how strictly they are enforced and for whom, right? And so, I could imagine you could repeal the law, for example, but there's a great degree of subjectivity involved, right, in terms of what constitutes a nuisance or noise that's too loud or what have you, and a lot of it really depends on what are the norms. I would hope, and maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I would hope that if people come into a community, they could sort of integrate themselves in the community, and people could welcome people in the community so that they could come together and collectively kind of try to hash out what's the appropriate way to deal with this, right? Do people, if people were invited to the celebrations, would they feel like it was too noisy or not? I don't know the answer to that necessarily, right? But maybe if you're probably less likely to call the cops if you're there celebrating too, right? So maybe it's an opportunity for people to come together and learn about another culture, and as opposed to seeing it as something that, that's something that they're doing, it's disturbing me. It's something that the community as a whole is celebrating, right? And so, there are groups, neighborhood groups that, try to stress, how do you bring people together in a neighborhood, right? And a lot of times it's organizing around a shared threat or a shared hope, right? And perhaps starting with that, whether it's schools or something that a lot of people can come together, or the trash pickups or something like that. And once they come together addressing that problem, other problems that might seem intractable, such as, they like to play their music too loud, or, it's too stiff or whatever, maybe it can be resolved, right? So I guess that's my optimistic view of how you would address it, as opposed to trying to do it through the law or some type of wide sweeping public policy change. I remember who I may be missing people. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll try to get to other people too. Yes.
I was wondering, so there's the whole shift also within public housing towards these mixed income communities. And that's obviously being developed on kind of the public policy side in concert with private institutions and developers. And I wonder if you see this as kind of a continuation or an example of this kind of gentrification process, or if it's a more complicated or different example, given people aren't necessarily going to have the opportunity to leave, that like they may have the opportunity to stay in their own unit, but they aren't necessarily going to have the option to move away from a mixed income community that's being built around them.
Yeah, so I think it could be an example of both to some extent, right? So I think, so the policy, those who are not familiar, probably the past 25 years or so, there's been policies, whether through Hope 6 or the Choice Neighborhoods program under the Obama administration and the like, of taking public housing, which tended to be exclusively low income, and redeveloping them into mixed income developments. And part of the rationale for that is that if you have a development that is exclusively the most disadvantaged population, that will lead to other types of problems. And so by creating a mixed income community, it will lead to a more stable community. And there's something to be said for that logic. I mean, public housing, when it was initially built, tended to target a more mixed clientele. It would include poor, in fact, it tended to exclude very poor households when it was first built. But then even in subsequent decades, there would be a mix, working class people, poor, the elderly. Probably it wasn't really until the 1970s where, as other housing opportunities opened up due to suburbanization, in many cities, it was only the poorest of the poor who were left behind in public housing. So I think that was a real problem. Part of the issue, though, is the way they decided to tackle this is to rely in part on private investment, right? And private investors want to invest where, they can make money, right? And those are the choicest locations. So they're not going to choose the public housing development that's way out in the middle of nowhere that no one wants to live. They're going to be drawn to sites that are centrally located, convenient, consistent with gentrification, right? And so I think, I know in New York City, many people are suspicious of that because many of the developments in New York City are situated in nice locations right on the river, and near Midtown Manhattan, near downtown Brooklyn. And so people are suspicious of anything, seeing it as another type of gentrification, even if the initial motivation was not necessarily that, but the way it's playing out, and because they're involving the private sector to bring in their capital, it is playing out in a way that is oftentimes consistent with gentrification. I'll take someone in the back. Yes?
I wonder what you feel about there's a program in Boston that's existed for many years called the MECO program.
The what program, sorry?
MECO. And kids from Boston were able to go to suburban schools. So their parents, feeling that they weren't getting a good education in Boston, would send them to Newton or Weston or the wealthier suburbs. Now, that's kind of, so the kids are still living in their homes.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the parents are able to get better education. I wonder where that cuts in terms of your ideas.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I think generally, I would be supportive of parents being able to exercise additional options. So I would be supportive in that sense. It perhaps is overlooking a bigger problem, which is that they feel like they have to send their kids outside of the community to get a good education, so that, ideally, they would have a choice of a good education closer to home or sending them further away. In many instances, we haven't solved that latter problem, how to make sure the schools in poorer communities are good and provide a very good education. And that's not I don't necessarily have a solution to say, well, this is how you build a great school in a community that's disadvantaged. But I think that's the bigger problem, or that's part of the problem as well. So yes, I would be in favor of the parents being able to exercise that option. Be nice if they also had the option, though, if they wanted to keep their kids in the community, and be able to do that and send them to a high-performing school. Yes, this gentleman here.
Professor, Dr. Friedman, first of all, thank you for your talk. I grew up, I went to high school in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I have a two-part question. One, based on your research, is there an example of a current community today that has implemented successful community engagement methods to address gentrification? And then the second part of my question, which really maybe you could answer first, is can you give me your definition of gentrification?
Okay, so the first one, or the latter question, the definition of gentrification, sort of a general definition would be a relatively low-income community that in the past had experienced some disinvestment and that now is experiencing sort of a reversal where you're starting to see higher income families move into the neighborhood and perhaps more investment, commercial investment or retail investment and the like. And oftentimes it includes a racial component, but excuse me, it doesn't have to. You could have gentrification, either whites moving into low-income white neighborhoods or Latinos or blacks, middle-class blacks moving into low-income black neighborhoods. And then the second question was a neighborhood that has used successful community organization. That's a great question. So, this may be ironic. I use in one of the classes I teach, and this may not be a good example, so I'd be curious to hear a reaction, but I use the Dudley Street Initiative as an example of a successful, well-functioning community organization. I've read about it, I visited the site, but I'm not here day to day, so I don't know, maybe tell me if I'm mistaken and I shouldn't be using that in my class. No offenses to anybody in the class from the Dudley Street Initiative,
Yeah.
but that's an example I use.
I don't think, using that example, I don't think that's totally mistaken, although Dudley Initiative is under a great deal of pressure. But I would say from an outsider perspective, Dudley Initiative would not be a bad example. Any other examples around the country?
Yeah, well, there are some, in New York, there are some good examples. Particularly, I like to use in my class examples of what happened in East Brooklyn and in the South Bronx, where you had, in East Brooklyn, you had a congregation or a coalition of churches come together, and in the South Bronx, you had some community-based organizations come together. What they did, though, and those of you not from New York, it may be hard to imagine, at the time, this is talking about the 1970s and 80s, there were whole neighborhoods that had been depopulated, had lots of abandoned buildings, and these groups were able to come together and help stabilize, play a very important role in stabilizing those communities, persuade the city to donate or subsidize the development of low and moderate income housing. And they were really some of the first actors that helped stabilize those neighborhoods. So I also, in Brooklyn, it's called the East Brooklyn Congregation. I may be forgetting the exact name, but it's a coalition of churches in Brownsville and East New York. In the South Bronx, there was Banana Kelly and the Desperados that did things. So I think those are both good examples of organizations and those were some of the most distressed neighborhoods anywhere. And they were able to successfully, basically, mobilize, get the community to come together. And certainly it hasn't been a panacea. It's not like, they solved all the problems, but they did have concrete successes that you can point to in those communities. And in some instances, there's some talk about gentrification in some parts of them, which I guess you could be seen as being too successful in some ways. Yes, I think you had your hand up for a while.
So one of the examples you listed giving residents that remain behind some power is the community land trusts. And I'm familiar with land trusts, but primarily in like a farm setting. How does community work in urban environments? Who are they empowering? Is it renters to own? Is it current owners to not sell? Like how does that function?
Right. So the ideal way that, or an idealized way that this could play out is if you had people come together and form an organization. It could be a community development corporation, for example, so it's based in the community, and they acquire land, right? It could either be, oftentimes, maybe a city would donate land to them, or they get funds from maybe a state housing finance agency and a foundation, and they acquire land. And so with that, they control the land, right? Hence the land trust. And then it could be developed either for, it could be owner occupied, and typically the way it would work is that it would work on a sort of shared or limited equity model, so that if the value of the land rises, the owner is only able to recoup a portion of that increase in the equity. That way the housing stays affordable. And they have formulas for how to factor in home improvements and things like that. Or it could be a rental model too, right? Where then they own the land and they just lease it at a modest rate, or a modest rate. So basically the idea is that the community-based organization would control the land. And I think the biggest challenge, obviously you have to have a well-organized community and a well-functioning community organization. And then you also need some mechanism for acquiring the land. And it probably works best if the neighborhood hasn't really already experienced significant gentrification, because then the land will be very expensive and it'll be much harder to do. So, are we out of time? Oh, okay. Sorry.